Tuma and Tahara. We're going to get nitty gritty today. So, no problem. Okay, so we're in a discussion about Tuma and Tahara because the Mishnah on 33 mentions that if the animal didn't have blood and you have not clean hands, you could eat it, implying that if it had blood, which is a liquid, which then made it susceptible to impurity, then you would not be able to eat it with your second-degree rabbinical impure hands. So now we're on 33b, and Amr Oshia. Our mission is talking about Hacha b'Chulin shenasu al paras hakodesh askinam. So there are people that are very stringent to make sure they eat their food, only holy food. Make sure it's always pure, since they were often eating sacrifices. So therefore, their even regular food that is contaminated will have these levels of tumah, and they were not allowed to eat them. And then there was people that also were very stringent to make sure that that their food will be pure because they're often eating truma. So now, according to Rabbi Oshia, our Mishnah is talking about chulin, regular food, but it was shenasu al taras hakodesh askinan. It was food that was treated like holy food, and therefore you have to make sure your hands are clean before you eat it. Udilo ki Rabbi Yeshua, and not like the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua. And this back and forth is going to take us for the whole next page. This Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Yeshua. Let's try to get the argument somewhat clear. The Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer Omer. Rabbi Eliezer says, Ha'ochel, ochel rishon, rishon, sheni, sheni, shlishi, shlishi. So, according to Rabbi Eliezer, if one eats a first degree contaminated food, so let's say I don't know, a zav or a nida or a nevela, which is an avatuma, touches a food, that becomes a rishon latuma. Now, rabbinically, if that food touches something else, it'll become a second, and then a third degree regarding it's considered it'll be a third degree for truma and a fourth degree for kodesh. But if one eats a first degree, he himself has a status of a first degree, and he'll cause something else to be a second degree. If he eats something which is a second degree, this is all rabbinical, then he becomes second degree, and if he touches something, it'll be a third degree. If he eats something which is a third degree of impurity, which is rare to have by foods, but rabbinically it could happen, then he becomes a third degree of impurity, and therefore there's only one case we can have a fourth degree, and that's by sacrificial foods. That's rabbinic. You can go all the way. 3 is already a novelty. You can make food a third degree of impurity. That's if it's truma, and a fourth degree by kodesh. But usually we don't get that far. For sure, not biblically, but rabbinically you could. So Rabbi Eliezer says basically that whatever the food is, you are what you eat. So if you eat a first degree, you're a first degree. You eat a second degree, you're a second degree. A third degree. That's Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yeshua sort of argues. Rabbi Yeshua argues, Omer, ha'ochel, whether you eat ochel rishon v'sheni, whether you eat a first degree or a second degree, you are a second degree of impurity. So he argues and he says, if you eat food that's a first degree of impurity, you are a second degree of impurity. If you eat food that's a second degree of impurity, you are a second degree of impurity. Now, what if you ate food that's a third degree of impurity? So now there seems to be a split. In regards to holy food, to sacrifices, sacrificial foods, so if you eat food that's a third degree, you become sheni lekodesh. Regarding now holy foods, we treat you like a sheni. We're almost on 34a. Two lines on 34a. So if you eat a third degree of impurity, food that's a third degree of impurity, you are now viewed as a second degree in terms of sacrifices, and therefore you would turn those into third degree. However, the ein sheni letruma. But if you eat a third degree, you do not become a second degree for truma. We treat sacrificial food more stringently than we treat truma. And this is all talking about bechulin shenasu al taros truma. We're not talking about eating truma that's impure. That you can't do. We're not talking about eating actual shlamim meat that's impure. That you can't do. We're talking about mundane food, but you're somebody who is very careful to always have pure food, whether it's because you're always around truma, or whether it's because you're always around kodesh, sacrificial food. You always eat pure food, and therefore, even when your mundane food becomes impure, you have to be careful not to eat it. So that's what we're talking about. And he says, this is talking about chulin shenas al taros truma. It's only regarding chulin's mundane food that's guarded on a level of sanctity for like truma. Says the Gemara, al taros truma and al taros kodesh lo. It's only talking about, according to Yeshua, are you only talking about food that's guarded on a level of truma, but not on the level of kodesh, on the level of sacrificial foods? So the chulin shenas al taros truma, al taros truma in, al taros kodesh lo. Kasavar, he holds chulin shenas al taros kodesh les behu shlishi. Rabbi Yeshua argues on Rabbi Eliezer, and he says, what's more common? It's more common for people to eat truma. Kohanim, all the Kohanim have to eat truma. How many people are always eating sacrificial foods? No, minority, not so many. So this that you eat something which is a third degree of impurity, and now that makes you a second degree of impurity, and now you're going to make what you eat a third degree of impurity, that was all stated by somebody who is careful, someone who's around truma a lot. He's very careful with his mundane food because he eats a lot of truma. But somebody else who's careful about sacrificial foods, so there we say there is no third degree. It doesn't exist. A third degree by mundane food. So that means that let's say I'm very careful to eat truma. So now I could be a second degree of impurity, and I can cause a third degree of impurity for food that's protected from impurity because I'm eating truma a lot. However, you don't eat truma a lot because you're not going. You are very careful though because you like to eat a lot of shlamims and chagigas and other things. So that's your fridge is stacked with those. So, but there's no decree upon you. If you're a second degree, you're not going to make that chulin into a third degree. If it's actually kodesh, or if it's actually has sanctity to it, then you could. But mundane food that's treated on a level of sanctity, that you can't do. So that shows us that the Mishnah can't be Rabbi Yeshua, because our Mishnah implies that if the animal were to have blood, it would make it susceptible for impurity, and your hands are viewed as second degree tumah, which would then make the animal a third degree of tumah, which is what we're worried about. But if we're talking about mundane food, that's just protected because you always eat sanctified food. According to Rabbi Yeshua, we didn't make that decree. We only made the ability for your second degree of impurity to cause mundane food to be a third degree of impurity by somebody who is always eating truma, and not by somebody who's always eating sacrifices. So that means that according to Rabbi Oshia, we're only going like the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer and not the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua. He doesn't have that. That far he didn't go. It's already one thing to treat mundane food like it's sacrificial food in regards to all of these stringencies. It's another thing to treat your hands already unwashed like a second degree is also a stringency. So how far are we going to go? So the biggest minority are the ones that are always careful to eat sacrificial foods. So that far, we're not going to say a third degree of impurity. That's too far. Therefore, our Mishnah cannot be the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, and it must accord with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Now we're going to the next page. Just getting started, don't worry. So first line of 34a. Yeah, nitty gritty. Yeah, Velukma. Now we're going to say, says the Gemara, hold on. You just told me, though, that Rabbi Yeshua agrees that if you're somebody who eats truma and you treat your mundane food like truma, so there you do have a third degree of impurity. 34a. Yeah, a third degree of impurity. So why don't you say our Mishnah is talking about that case? Velukme b'chulin shenasu al taras truma. Let our Mishnah be a case of mundane food, which is treated with a sanctity of truma, because you're very careful to always stack your fridge with truma food. So even even your regular Tropicana is going to be considered like a level of truma. Therefore, or your meat will be considered can become a third degree of impurity, and therefore our Mishnah that says that if you have unclean hands and the animal were to bleed, so then it would render it invalid. It would be a third degree of impurity. That's talking about somebody who's careful to always eat truma. And then it could be like Rabbi Yeshua. So say it's b'chulin shenasal taras truma for Rabbi Yeshua. Yeah. Someone had a good question yesterday. Someone asked. When the blood goes on the animal and makes it susceptible for impurity, the whole animal becomes susceptible? Only the part that the blood is on? How does that work? Huh? That's a good question. But that's really a general question. Let's say part of the food becomes wet, and now it's susceptible for impurity. So that means the other part also. It's probably explicit somewhere. I just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've never heard of
a split.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've looked it up.
Right. I mean, that's what your question sounded like. I'm just saying. He's working on his humility. It's fine. So yeah. I don't know. I also doesn't ring a bell, but when it comes to Tum and Tahara, it's hard to like. It's not like fresh on the head, It's like when it comes up, you're like, oh no.
There's no intent about it.
Right.
No sense of what it is.
Right. So okay. So that's that. Now, so says the Gemara, lo sakadaitach. Don't view that as a plausible answer. Why? Well, let's think for a second. Our Mishnah is talking about meat. Unwashed hands touching meat, that blood went on the outside of it and rendered it susceptible for impurity. Now let's think about it. What's more plausible? Are we talking about mundane food that you protect, that you treat like sacrificial food, or you treat like truma? Well, there's meat by sacrificial food, obviously. There's no meat by truma. So we're talking about mundane food. So you have in your fridge, juices and wines. You have grains. You have oils. Then you have meat. So your whole fridge, we treat it as if it's all truma, even the mundane food. Okay, but even the meat, you'll never have truma meat. Doesn't exist. So, but you will have obviously sacrificial meat. So says the Gemara, it's not plausible to say our Mishnah is talking about truma. Why? Because the truma basar mi'ika. There's no meat by truma. So now the Gemara says, 1 second. But our Mishnah mentioned a chaya, a wild animal, not a domesticated animal. There's no wild animals by sacrificial food either. So elamai bekachim, hayachaya bekachim mika. There's no chaya bekachim. There's no wild animal by kachim, by sacrificial food. So it says the Gemara, okay, but basar bebasar michla. Confusing meat is easy. So you have what's a good wild animal? A deer. Good. So you have deer meat and you have a steak. So you're treating all of it like it's a sacrificial food. It's mundane food, but you treat it on that level because you always eat sacrificial food. Okay, but between deer meat and steak meat, it's easy to be confused. So the deer meat will also be treated like sacrificial food, even though it'll never become sacrificial food because it's a deer and not a goat and ox or whatever. However, right, the same way maybe similar like we treat chicken like meat. Right? The Gemara says it's easy to be confused, even though We hold that biblically chicken and milk is not prohibited biblically. Two opinions, but we hold not that way. But between chicken and meat, it's very easy to be confused. Which rep? Oh, really? Oh, he's saying, yeah, you got chicken and yeah. So Mika basar chalav michlaf, but basar bepeiri lo michlaf. You're not going to confuse your. Oh wow! Now that this, I'm going to treat the steak. We're going to treat the steak like truma. Steak and your grape juice are not yet easily confused. Okay, so that's the. What is that? Except for vegan. So now that's in terms of our Mishnah. It's Rabbi Eliezer and not Rabbi Yeshua. Fine. Now Amar Ula, we're going to go back and analyze the back and forth over here. Amar Ula, Chavarai Amrin, Chulin Shenasu Al Taras HaKodesh, Udilok Rabbi Yeshua, the Ana Amina Rabbi Yeshua. He Ula says, my friends, and we'll see who those friends are, which friend it is. He said that our Mishnah is talking about mundane food that is treated on a level of sanctity and not like Rabbi Yeshua, like we just said. But I, Ula, say, Anamina, Rabbi Yeshua, I said that the Mishnah could even be Rabbi Yeshua. Okay. And that last line that Rabbi Yeshua said, I'm only talking about, when Rabbi Yeshua said, I'm only things that cannot become a third degree of impurity, was talking about truma and not kodesh and not sacrificial food, which led us to conclude our Mishnah can't be Rabbi Yeshua. Ula says he was saying alomi ba'i ka'amar. It's a not necessary to teach format. For example, lomi ba'i chulin shenasu al taras kodesh. I didn't have to state, hence I didn't state that I'm also talking about sacrificial food, mundane food that we treat on a level of sanctity like sacrificial food, because the chamiri, that's much more stringent than truma. This bushlishi, ela afilu chulin shenasu al taras truma nami is bushlishi. But I said even food that's treated on a level of truma also is going to have a third degree of impurity. So the actual line that Rabbi Yeshua said when he said his halacha about a third degree of impurity, which is what we're looking for. Our Mishnah, only way to understand our Mishnah is if you can make meat third degree of impurity, because your unwashed hands are second degree. So Rabbi Yeshua said there's only third degree impurity by truma, by food that's treated like truma, not by sanctity. So the Gemara originally thought it was by truma and not by sanctity. But Ula is saying, no, it was not necessary to teach by sacrificial food. That's more stringent than truma. He taught truma because that was a novelty. So according to Ula, Rabbi Yeshua agrees that there's a third degree of impurity even by sacrificial food. And therefore our Mishnah could be Rabbi Yeshua. But his friends argued with him. His friend said that our Mishnah cannot be Rabbi Yeshua. And they probably took this line literally when he said it only applies by truma, yeah, by sacrificial, by kodesh food, no. Okay. So now, step by step, who is this friend that argued on Ula, who said our Mishnah can only be Rabbi Eliezer and not Rabbi Yeshua, since by Rabbi Yeshua we don't have a third degree of impurity when it comes to treating mundane food like sacrificial food. We only have a third degree of impurity when you treat mundane food like truma food. Who was that opinion? That was Rabba Bar Chana. That was Rabba Bar Chana. The Amar, as he said, Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. He's going to say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So which is going to be relevant because we're going to say later someone else in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabba Bar Chana says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, here's why I hold what I hold. That Rabbi Yeshua does not have a third degree of impurity by truma. He said, "My ahadri Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua lahadadi." We have their final statements, but what was their back and forth? What was behind the scenes? What was their discussion? Why do you hold this way? Why do you hold that way? So, remember, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you are what you eat. You eat a first degree, you're a first degree. You eat a second degree, you're a second degree. You eat a third degree, you're a third degree. Rabbi Yeshua said, if you eat a first or second degree, you're a second degree. That's what Rabbi Yeshua said. That's one point of contention that he argues. And then he also says, though, if you would eat a third degree, you become a second degree for Kodesh, but not for Truma. If you would eat a third degree, you'd be a Sheni LeKodesh. You'd become a second degree for Kodesh, but not for Truma. But only in regard, you'd become like this. If you eat a third degree of impurity, so you become a second degree only for sacrificial foods, and we're only talking about food that was protected from people who ate truma, not protected from people who eat kodesh, because that's a much bigger minority. So, okay. So let's see that. So now, Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua. He said to him, Rabbi Eliezer said to Rabbi Yeshua, Matzinu ochel chamer min ha'ochel. I'll show you that I'll find you an example of food that's more stringent than the one who eats it. For example, the ilu nevelas of tahor, we know that a nevela of a bird, of a kosher bird, so you have a kosher bird that dies. Well, if you touch that, that doesn't cause impurity. That case of a nevela by a kosher bird. Bachutz lo metame. So if you were to touch it, it doesn't cause impurity. The ilu ochla, but if you were to eat it, metame begadim beisabliya, then it would impurify your clothing. So I'm showing you that the food, meaning the eating of the food, is more stringent than the one who's eating it. Because the one who's eating it, if he touches it, it doesn't do anything to him. But if he eats the food, then it will cause impurity. So, sorry. Sorry, by the way, the one who eats it is more stringent than the food itself. The food itself, if you touch it, won't cause impurity to you. But one who eats it does. So you see that the one who eats it has a stringency over the food itself. Therefore, the anu heyach lo nasa ochel k'maychel. Ochel k'maychel. How could we not make it that you are what you eat? I showed you that a nevela, a bird nevela, which is a kosher bird nevela, that one who eats it is more stringent than the food itself. So too here, if you eat impure food, you should be just as impure as it, not less. So if I eat a first degree, I have to be a first degree, because the one who eats it is more stringent, as I showed you by nevela. Now, Rabbi Yeshua doesn't hold that, because he holds if you have a first degree, you're going to be a second degree. You're going to be a level down. You're not the same as what you eat. Rabbi Yeshua, don't you see that one who eats it has a certain stringency? Because by nevela we showed you. Rabbi Yeshua says, no, that's a novelty, and you can't learn from a novel case. So I'll prove to you the opposite. That the food itself is more stringent than the one who eats it. And therefore, if I eat a first degree of impurity, I'm not going to be as strict. I have to be less strict. One step down, I'll be a second degree of impurity. Where do you find that? The food is more stringent than the eater. The ilu maichel, the food itself requires a kibetza, an egg's worth, to cause impurity. The ha'ocha, one who eats it, it's only until he eats a chatzi pras, half of a loaf, which is 2 eggs worth. So you see, for the food to become impure, takes less. It's more stringent. It takes less to make the food impure than it does the eater. The eater takes 2 eggs. If he only has 1 egg, he's not going to be able to cause impurity. The food gets impurity by a kibetza, an egg's worth. But one who eats it is not going to be impure. So if I eat 1 egg of impure food, it doesn't cause impurity to me. I have to eat a chatzi pras. Chatzi pras is always the amount that's considered a food. So it's kedei achilas pras, but in this case, it's a chatzi pras. It's a half of a loaf, which is which is 2 eggs. So, yeah. Okay, so I'm showing you that the food is more stringent than the eater. Therefore, when I have a first degree of impurity that I eat, I can't be as strict. I have to be one step down because I'm showing you here that the food is more strict than the eater. How can I make how can I make that the one who eats it like the food itself? The food itself is more stringent. What does Rabbi Eliezer do with that? Doesn't he agree you are what you eat? He says, Tuma mishiurin lo gamrinan. You have a few rebuttals. First of all, I don't learn levels of impurity from the actual measurement of what causes Tuma and Tahara. You have your measurement, he has his measurement, but that doesn't show me one's more strict or more lenient. The Ode, another question on you, Lidvarecha. Rabbi Eliezer says, according to you, Rabbi Yeshua, Sha'ata Omer al Rishon Sheni, when I eat a first degree of this food, I become a second degree, so that's fine. Yafata Omer. But that's good. I understand in your world that when you have a first degree, you become a second degree. But how come when you eat a second degree, you remain at a second degree? The logic doesn't go. Your first degree caused you to be a second degree because you told me the food is more strict. Fine. But then when you have a second degree, you should logically become a third degree. And yeah, you become a second degree. So, Yafat Omer, but Sheni Lama. So how's he going to respond? So now we have a rule as follows, that another rabbinic decree about purity and impurity, that usually a food that's a second degree of impurity, rabbinically, the only thing it can cause impurity to is simply understood as actual truma. It can cause truma to be a third degree of impurity. And sacrificial food, it can cause it to be a fourth degree of impurity. We're in the middle of discussing mundane food treated like truma and treated like sacrificial food. How far do you go? That's an extension of that rule. However, there's one caveat. If a second degree food touches a food that is wet, so that when it touches the liquid, rabbinically, that liquid becomes a first degree of impurity, which then causes the food to be a second degree of impurity. So if food ever touches something wet, that reverts back to a first degree of impurity, which then can now cause whatever it's touching to be a second degree of impurity. That's a more common case throughout the Gemara. So Rabbi Yeshua tells him, what do you mean? I'll show you that I have a case of a second degree of impurity, which causes something else to be a second degree of impurity. A second degree of impurity food can cause another food to be a second degree of impurity. How? Because it makes the water that's on the food a first degree, and the water makes the food a second degree. So I found a precedent that a second degree can make something else a second degree. So me too. If I eat a second degree of impurity, I'll become a second degree of impurity. So to that, Rabbi Eliezer says, okay, if you're going to pattern yourself after that, so then be consistent. Meaning, Amar lo, the hamashkin nami techila havu. We have a case, right? We know that the food causes a first degree of impurity if it touches the water. The Tanan, kol haposel betruma, metame b'mashkin lios techila. Whatever invalidates truma, which means second degree of impurity, causes truma to be a third degree of impurity. So that can make mashkin, liquids, a first degree of impurity. Chutz mi tful yom, except for a tful yom, someone who just went to the mikveh and awaiting nightfall, his impurity is much lower, and therefore he's not going to be able to make water a first degree of impurity if he touches it. Fine. So if that's true, so then let the second degree of impurity when you eat it make you a first degree of impurity, not a second degree of impurity if you're going down that route. The Ode, another question that Rabbi Eliezer has on Rabbi Yeshua, Shlishi Sheni Lama. How come you stated that when you have a third, if you consume a food, mundane food, which is protected from Truma, how come you said that ups you a level? You're going, the whole time you're going down. You're going down or as equal, but now you're going up. You eat a third degree of impurity, and now you become a sheni lakodesh, a second degree of impurity for kodesh, if you're eating food that's protected from truma. How does that work? Oh, so now, remember, there's a little complicated. The guy ate, let's say Reuven ate third degree impurity, food that has a third degree of impurity. It's all rabbinic. Now, Rabbi Yeshua says he now has a status of second degree impurity regarding kodesh, regarding sacrificial foods. If he were to touch a sacrificial food, so that would make it a third degree of impurity. And the food that we're talking about is food that's been protected from the consumption of truma. Yeah. So now, that's his question. So Amar Lo, Rabbi Yeshua tells him, I'll tell you why I go from 3 to 2. Amar Lo, Afani lo amarti ela b'truma. I only say this in regard to truma. Now, the logic's going to be like this: that that food that's guarded from truma, we're going to treat more leniently than food that's guarded from kodesh, and therefore, there's an impurity called midras that you lie on it. So if a zav, a ziva, a nida lies on clothing, it makes it impure. Now, people that are strict to only have kodesh food, they will treat the clothing of the truma eaters as invalid because maybe his wife sat on the clothing when she was a nida. So they're more strict. The truma eaters themselves, if they guard it, they guard it. That'll be fine. But things that are guarded by the truma eaters, the sacrificial eaters are not going to view it as guarded because truma truma shetaharaso tuma he eitzel kodesh. The things that are guarded from truma for the sacrificial eaters is considered invalid. So that's why I said that when you have a third degree of impurity and you eat it, you become a second degree of impurity regarding sacrificial foods, regarding food that was protected by the truma eaters, because protected by the truma eaters doesn't suffice for the sacrificial food eaters. Right? You can imagine just like nowadays, right? A certain level of stringencies of orthodoxy come in. What we think is good, they'll never touch it, right? Like there are people that are stringent when it comes to very big organizational kashrus organizations. So by definition, you have to have some leniencies, right? So the OU is huge. So you're going to have certain leniencies for mass production. So certain people are stringent. So they'll view what we view as ideal, they'll view as not. So therefore, I treated it stringently regarding kodesh, regarding food that was protected from truma. Okay, now we brought all this because Ula said that my friend, Rabbi Barchana, said that our Mishnah can only be, he said that Rabbi Yeshua only stated there's a third degree of impurity regarding sacrificial food, as we just saw. Will treat you like a second degree regarding sacrificial food, not regarding truma. That was the opinion of Rabbi Barchana, and therefore our Mishnah cannot be Rabbi Yeshua. Ula held that Rabbi Yeshua allowed there even is a concept of third degree of impurity by sacrificial food, meaning by mundane food that's treated very stringently. There's also a third degree of impurity there, and Rabbi Yeshua agreed to that, and therefore our Mishnah could be Rabbi Yeshua. Okay. Now, in the middle of this, we quoted that this Rabbi Barchana, who is Ula's friend, who says that according to Rabbi Yeshua, there's no third degree of impurity for Kodesh, only for Truma. That was the opinion of Rabbi. He quoted that in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, Amar Rabbi Zeira, Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is quoted by later rabbis saying, in the name of Rabbi Yanai, Ha'ochel shlishi shel chulin, one who eats mundane food, that's a third level of impurity. Shenasu al taras hakodesh. How does regular mundane food get a third level of impurity? It's only food that's protected because it's for people that are only eating sacrificial foods. Nase gufo sheni lakodesh. He becomes a sheni lakodesh. So even food that's been protected for people that eat sacrificial food, even that, if you would eat a third degree of food, you become a second degree of impurity. Now, on that we ask, this that Rabbi Asi just said, funny, it was Rabbi Zeir in the name of Rabbi Asi. Meaning it was Rabbi Zeir in the name of Rabbi Asi, right? Rabbi Zeir himself has a question on you, Rabbi Asi, who quoted Rabbi Yochanan, that when you have a third degree of impurity, you become a second degree for holy food, even if the food was protected from the sacrificial food eaters, it was on a high level of sanctity. Shlishi sheni lekodesh ve'ein sheni letruma bechulin shenasu altaras truma in altaras kodesh lo. There's conflicting views in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. This that Rabbi Yeshua holds, that you eat food, that's a third degree of impurity. And that makes you now a second degree of impurity regarding mundane food that's treated like sacrificial food. When was that stated? By mundane food by the Truma eating people, or by mundane food by the Kodesh eating people? So Rabbi Bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that's only by food that's by the Truma eating people, because we don't view their kashrus up to par with ours. But now we're saying that Rabbi Asi said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, even food that's treated by the Kodesh eating people, by the sacrificial eating people, which is a higher level of stringency, even there, if you would have a third degree of food that's impure, a third degree of impurity, it'll make you a second degree. Not only by food that's from the Kohanim people. So, for example, you go to the Kahana house, and they're very stringent to only have. They view all their food like on a truma status. So you go to their house, and there's food that's a third degree of impurity. When you eat that, you become a second degree of impurity in terms of causing sacrificial food to be a third degree of impurity. So that was our original statement. Now, the reason why that happens, why you go up and not the other way, is because we don't really trust the truma eaters to be up to par stringent-wise with our stringencies. So therefore, a third degree of impurity there, we're going to treat as a second degree. But now we're saying, even if you go to the Maravet's house, which only eats sacrificial foods, in that house, if you eat something which is a third degree of impurity, and they're more strict in how they deal with things, it'll still make you a second degree of impurity, even though it's at the Maravet's house and not at the Kahana house. So which one is it? That's our question. And they're both stated in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So the question is, what did Rabbi Yochanan really say? So Amar Lei, so he told him, Lomi Bayi Kamar. It's Lomi Bayi Kamar. He doesn't mean only in the Kahana house, he even means in the Maravet's house. So it means both. He just didn't say it. Says the Gemara, what do you mean you can't say that? It says at the end of our Mishnah and the end of our Brisa, V'afani lo amarti ela b'truma kamar. He said, I'm only talking about people that eat truma, that the third degree of impurity can make you a second degree of impurity for sacrificial foods. So how could you tell me that it was a lomi bayi? It was not necessary to state format. I said, I'm only talking about truma. Says the Gemara, you're right. At the end of the day, it's Amarai Ninu V'alibad Rabbi Yochanan. There are conflicting views that were stated from Rabbi Yochanan. What did Rabbi Yochanan say? So one opinion said that he said only regarding people that guard themselves from truma, which are less stringent in the Kodesh eater's eyes. If you eat a third degree of impurity, mundane food there, you become a second degree of impurity only to impurify sacrificial foods. And the other opinion said no. Even if you're in the very stringent house, in that house, even if you have a third degree of impurity, you'll become a second degree of impurity regarding sacrificial foods. We're out of time. Yeah, 6. Let's see. I guess let's do four more lines. Amar Ula says, Ha'ochel shlishi shel chulin, shenasu al tarish truma. So you're very stringent to only eat all your mundane food has a status of truma. And ha'ochel shlishi shel chulin, you ate now a third degree of impurity of mundane food. So nifsal gufo milechol truma. You are now no longer able to eat truma because you had a third degree of impurity. My kamashlan tanina. I learned that already. Shlishi, when you're a third degree of impurity, you're a sheni lekodesh, the ain't sheni letruma, bechulin shenasu al tarish truma. We already taught that you are a shlishi is a third degree of impurity that's eaten, makes you a second degree for sacrificial foods, but not for truma regarding food that was guarded on a truma level. So says the Gemara, sheni hu de lo have, but hashlishi have. You won't be a second degree of impurity, but you'll be a third degree of impurity. So therefore, this statement has already been stated. So why do you have to repeat it? When it said I'm not a second degree, you would have thought I'm not a second degree of impurity and I'm not a third degree of impurity. The idea the Amar Sheni B'Kodesh, Amar Nami ain't Sheni B'Truma. And it just parallels. The fact that I said I'm not a second degree for Kodesh, I said that I'm not a second degree for Truma either. Kamash Malan, when I said I'm not a second degree for Truma, it meant second degree no, but I am a third degree. Third degree, and therefore I can't eat Truma. That's all it was saying. Okay. Yeah, this is fun.
Yasher Koach.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but you could have skipped, but the guy that skips, how's he going to feel to see him?